I'm Garrett McQueen,
I'm Scott Blankenship.
and this is Triloquy, True and Real Stories from the Fringes of Classical Music. All right, so today, Scott, we're going back into the classroom a little bit, a sort of heady conversation with Dr. Garrett Schumann. He is a Michigan-based music theorist, composer. He's taught at colleges and universities around the country. What we dig into today is his new research project, ÄPEX, the performance series based on that work, the ÄPEX Contemporary Performance, how the way that we teach and think about music theory specifically plays a role into the composers and the artists who were left out of the conversation. The idea that traditional quote-unquote classical music is much more diverse than we have always thought of it. So really a great conversation with him. But Scott, something I wanted to touch on with you before we get into that interview is the way things are taught incorrectly, or how education often just does not include a number of things. I think we've brought it up before at this point. We have both been watching the show Watchmen, and
Right.
and how the Tulsa race riots were something that were just left out of the conversation for you as far as teaching. For me, when I think back to my high school history courses, the Vietnam War, certainly not the Korean War, just dark spots in my education, based on who writes the books and
Right.
what stories that they want to put out there. Are there really glaring dark spots in your education?
Yeah, a lot. It seems like in the history classes, we talk about the history in the black communities that's missed and Vietnam and Korean wars. It did seem a lot like everything was focused around when the Constitution was written and
Sure,
signed.
sure.
That seemed to be the heaviest bits. And remember that I was in high school in the 80s, so we didn't have the internet and all these means of getting information in quickly,
Right.
or the textbooks in quickly. So, who knows how dated our stuff that we were using was. I have no idea.
You had to go all the way into the encyclopedia, huh?
We still had printed encyclopedias, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, go over and look it up.
What about on the well, I don't know if I've ever asked you this. Did you take any music appreciation or any classical music courses in college?
Music appreciation, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you learn about black composers in that
Some.
course? Oh, did
Some
you?
Chevalier de Saint Georges was in there. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
See, I was an adult the first time I heard his name, and when you listen to Joseph Bologna Chevalier de Saint Georges, if you didn't know, you will probably just say, "Oh, this is some Haydn or
Right.
or maybe some Mozart." But
Right.
a black composer of many eras past who wrote music just as big C classical as all of the other ones. So yeah, huge shout out to Joseph Bologna Chevalier de Saint Georges. The first black composer or the first black person to lead a regiment during the French Revolution, the only
Mhm.
all black regiment. A master fencer, a incredible violinist, and also a composer. So a triple, maybe even a quadruple threat that we don't always learn about. A composer that I have been listening to and was exposed to not too long ago was a black composer named Clarence Cameron White. and thanks to Rachel Barton Pine, a lot of his music is going around more with the recordings she did. Not just a black composer, but a Tennessee composer.
Mm.
I understand. So from my home state, and listening to sort of the bluesiness and the jazziness. He has a tune called the Levy Dance that I always love seeing on my playlist. Just another one of those many names that has been left out of the history books traditionally. What about on the Scott, on the radio and production side? Are there things that you didn't learn in your formal education that you just apply every day? I mean, certainly technology has changed over the years, but maybe just some common practice that they left out of the curriculum.
I think that things have changed, though, that they are including more coursework that deals with emotional intelligence.
Hmm.
So you can learn how to run the equipment to do an interview, but actually conducting it in a thoughtful way is different.
Talk more about that. How the education plays into that.
Well, there are some people that believe that if you want to be a news reporter, you can be taught to come up with questions to get the answer for your story.
The answer that you want.
No, the you can conduct your interview in a news way where there is no emotion. You're trying to get the facts.
Ah, I
Okay, so
see.
like maybe political or something like that. But in the work that you and I do here, and primarily you when you're conducting these interviews, there is a certain level of emotional intelligence and listening that needs to happen in order for that conversation to be interesting for somebody outside of it to hear. So there are people that believe that that can't be taught. That that is a feel. That is something inherent.
And you know what you're making me think about is, we have always talked about code switching as it applies to our job, really using our language and
Hmm.
breaking down the tradition of what the classical host sounds like on the radio.
Hmm.
I'm wondering if that's a conversation that's happening in the news world, or if news people are beginning to relax a little bit, lower their shoulders a little bit.
Probably the people who also have the opinion shows in addition to their interviewing thing that's probably happening there.
Well, with you having the formal background, I'm wondering if you could ask me a question in a news way, and then ask me that same question in a more relaxed or non-news way,
About music?
or anything.
Okay. In a news way, I would say something like, Garrett, from looking at your programming, I see that you favor uh, composers like Dmitri Shostakovich. You like some contemporary composers that have passed away more recently. Tell me a little bit about why those speak to you.
Okay, and then I suppose my answer, if I were on a news show, would be more history based.
Hmm.
Talk about how classical music is alive and well, and it's very important to me to unearth some of that more contemporary history so that we understand that aesthetics and all of that stuff has changed over the centuries, but they're equally valid. So
Right.
I guess that would be my news, my
Right.
on Action News answer.
Right. Now, if I was going to ask you a similar question, but I want you to open up and emote and all that sort of thing, I would say something like, Garrett, last night you and I were talking about the Kwanzaa special, and you singled out the fact that that piece by Florence Price really made you feel even more connected to it in the context of Kwanzaa.
Hmm.
Tell me about the realization and how you came to it.
Okay, so I see what you mean, because now that question has me thinking more about my my personal life
Hmm.
and the relationship that, Garrett McQueen 1.0 has with classical music and black classical music. Okay, that's interesting. So do you,
The loads of interpersonal communication things that go on too.
yeah,
Just being able to deal with the other people that you have to work with in order to make the finished product in whatever business that you're in.
yeah.
I don't know that everybody's getting that sort of help or classwork
Yeah, yeah,
experience.
yeah. Really interesting conversation. Well, so yeah, as Garrett Schumann will go into the way that music history, music theory, composition, the way all of those things have been taught in a way that leaves out big chunks of the repertoire. So what he's dedicated himself to is unearthing, the diversity of classical music in days and even centuries past,
Hmm.
celebrating the contemporary sounds and aesthetics of classical music today. So yeah, really great conversation with Garrett Schumann that we'll jump into now. Garrett Schumann, a pleasure to have you here on Triloquy. You have a really great name and you spell it correctly, even.
Thank you. Yeah, it's always a conversation starter in music schools.
Oh, your last name. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I
Oh,
was
yeah.
talking
We
about
do
your
spell
first
the
name.
Garrett the right way too.
Yes,
Yeah,
two
you're
R's, two
absolutely right
T's.
about
That is
that.
the appropriate
Yes.
spelling. But your last name as well. What sorts of conversations do you get into concerning your surname? I mean, obviously, are you related to Robert and Clara? I'm sure is one.
Yeah, I remember once in my undergrad, this master's student, like the first thing he asked me was like, "Are you the great grandson of Robert Schumann?" And I was like, "There's a lot more to me than that, and I don't even know. Although I do have tinnitus, so maybe I am."
Mm.
Maybe there's a connection there. Well, we actually aren't going to talk much about the Schumanns today. You have an organization, ＡPEX Contemporary Performance, for us to dive into. But first, I wanted to get a little bit of your story. So I met you in the Detroit area, but I didn't know you were from Texas. You've traveled a bit of everywhere so far in your career.
Yeah, so I was born in Houston, and then we lived in Dallas until fourth grade, and we moved to Connecticut for middle school and high school for me. And then I did my undergrad at Rice University back in Houston. And then when we met, I was in grad school at Michigan. I can't remember what phase of grad school, but I've been in Michigan since 2010. And it's great. My wife works for the University of Michigan. We live in the town next to Ann Arbor called Ypsilanti, which is
Hmm.
great because we don't have to deal with stuck-up Ann Arbor people. So
Okay,
we love it
okay.
there.
But then you also teach down in Boone, North Carolina, right?
Well, I taught there for 1 year last year, so I've had a lot of different teaching jobs. At four schools, I've taught at Appalachian State just for 1819, and Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Madonna University in Livonia, Michigan, and then also the University of Michigan. I was a faculty member there for 1 year. So I'm living a prototypical adjunct experience, teaching at a lot of different places, teaching a lot of different classes. And what's been great is I've gotten to work with a lot of different students with different backgrounds and values and concerns and experiences. So that's been really influential on me, even though it does not pay well and is really stressful.
Yeah, and you described it as prototypical, and that's actually what I was going to ask. If from your perspective, that's sort of the typical lifestyle from a composer, music theorist with this doctorate in music, if that's the way the life typically looks.
Oh, definitely. I mean, there are a few people I know from my schooling who have tenure track jobs, but they are definitely in the minority. There's so many more people who, like me, have been adjuncting for, 5 or more years, and you just kind of get used to it as the norm. But the sort of get a doctorate and then get a tenure track job and work at one school for 40 years, that's becoming increasingly rare.
Hmm. Hmm. Do you find that your specific interests within music. We're going to talk about the work you do in contemporary music. Do you think that gets in the way? I mean, are schools interested in new conversations surrounding classical music in the same way that you are?
It depends on the school and it depends on the program. I'll just tell you with the context of the jobs that I've had, most of them are pretty receptive. Part of that is because as an adjunct, they kind of just want a warm body in the room to teach the class. But in at least two of the jobs I had very explicit conversations with my superiors about designing a curriculum that was more inclusive and also involved repertoire that I like to use that's non-traditional, like a lot of popular music and that sort of thing. And specifically, when I started teaching at Western Michigan University in 2016, my bosses there were like, you have to include music by women composers, which was something I was already doing, but it felt really great to have them give me the institutional green light to really dive into that. And so some of the places I've taught have been really open to that, but then other places are much more traditionally minded and want to stick with the more conservative curriculum. That's really just Madonna University. Everywhere else I've taught has been really open.
And what have these classes been? Like, what is the name of the class these students take from you?
Oh, so I've taught just about everything that you can teach if you have a background in composition and theory. I've taught electronic music, composition lessons, aural skills, all the way up the sequence, and written theory all the way up the sequence, orchestration as well. So whenever I teach those classes, because I've been kind of nomadic in my career, I sort of stick to the same playbook, which is including a variety of genres where appropriate, and also, using it as an opportunity to continue my research of composers of color, women composers, composers who just aren't as well known, as long as it's demonstrative of the topics that we're dealing with. And it really depends on the course, but I try to include that approach in every course that I teach across that spectrum.
What do you think? What do you think fuels that? Because when I think back specifically to my written theory classes, it's very much based in the rules, the counterpoint rules of Bach and how they apply to late Baroque and classical music. But when you're talking about bringing new music into those spaces, what's the goal? Because it seems like the art of learning music theory and counterpoint and all that is based in tradition itself.
I think it comes from a place of trying to make the topics more relatable to the students. So I remember the first class I ever taught when I was a graduate student, it was aural skills. And I was sticking with the repertoire and the materials that I was given, which was mostly piano music. But then there was a percussionist who was like, I don't care about this, there's no percussion. Or a violinist who was like, this is piano, like, can we use something with strings? So even from that perspective, it was like, I have to find new examples that they'll connect with because it represents their instrument. And then when I started teaching aural skills for the musical theater program at the University of Michigan, which has different curricular goals, but they have a much more diverse student body. And so then it was like, well, I have to include music by African American musicians because I have like 5 African American students who would bring it up if I didn't do that. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of comes from this approach of making the sort of demystifying the topics. So like if I can show how 5 different composers from the late 18th century approached sonata form, it becomes less of a monolith for my students. It's more like, oh, this was a practice that composers had at the time. And yeah, there's some rules, but people varied their approaches in different ways. And it's kind of always come from this point of demystification and then relatability. And fortunately, that's lined up well with some of my other interests. Like I do a lot of research of heavy metal music, and so students love it if I can show something happening in like a classical piece or a Broadway song when I was teaching the musical theater kids, and then show the exact same thing happening in a metal song. And I've always found and gotten feedback confirming this, at least from some students, like showing an idea appearing in a lot of different places makes it a little bit easier, or at least shows it from different angles. That makes it a little bit easier to grasp, but also adds meaning to it. Instead of focusing on, you have to find meaning in this one example or this one composer's application of the idea, showing that the idea is spread across a lot of different kinds of music. I've always found that works.
I read that you mentioned heavy metal. I've read that you have actually been recognized for the relationship that you dive into between music theory and heavy metal. I want to learn more about that. Was there an award involved, or what was it?
Uh, well, I've been published in Music Theory Spectrum. For that research, and I've
And that's a magazine, or sorry?
It's a journal,
Okay.
academic journal, and then I presented at international conferences on heavy metal, and I've been asked to do guest presentations on it. I've never won an award, but it's kind of like a thing that people associate with me, like, oh, Garrett, he's the heavy metal guy. So.
Do you have any?
Even with my compositions, because it really influences my own music, and so, like, I recently wrote a piece for this fabulous voice and saxophone duo, and they were like, Garrett, we need you to write a heavy metal romp. We know you can do this. Create this piece for us. So it's like part of my brand, I guess.
Heavy metal romp. I like how that sounds. Do you have any? Do you have any examples of And I have something in my mind that I'll revisit a little later. But do you have any examples of music theory, sonata form, one of these traditionally classical motifs applying in heavy metal? Is there a go-to for you that you provide to kids or anyone curious?
Well, there's some interesting counterpoint things that happen in heavy metal that you can associate with traditional classical music. In terms of structure, not sonata form, but there's some interesting versions of binary form that happen in heavy metal, where like the song will end with a whole section of completely new material, and that's very similar to like a Baroque binary form, at least in concept. Often what I use heavy metal for is more free-flowing form examples. So because it's a genre that values virtuosity in the performance and composition, there are a lot of interesting structures that happen if you look in the right places. And so it's a good challenge for students to try to figure out what's going on. And then there are really amazing examples of things with rhythm and meter that we don't see a lot in classical music. And so it's a great resource for that. And then there's some harmonic things too. Like I remember when I was teaching aural skills at Michigan, there's a Megadeth song that has an augmented sixth chord in it, and so I like showed that when we were talking about listening for augmented sixth chords. And there's some interesting things with sets and the octatonic scale that happen in particularly the music of Slayer and Meshuggah that I've used for that. And it's always fun when even 12-tone, there's some heavy metal music that's like intentionally using the 12-tone technique. So particularly set theory and 12-tone, you're seeing your students start to glaze over, their eyes looking at, Second Viennese School music, and then it's like, wait, let's listen to this Meshuggah song, and you can see a set happening as well.
Yeah, when they hear someone shredding,
Yeah, oh yeah.
That's awesome.
When I was at Guitar Center recently, I saw that there's a transcription for electric guitar of the Paganini Etudes. So they're marketing to it, and there's a lot of bands out there, like Garrett was saying, that are playing interesting chords that are rooted in all this classical theory, and you'd never know it.
Yeah,
because it's got a metal distortion pedal on it.
Well, there's a German band, Accept, which is one of the
Yeah.
old they're from the 70s, and their guitarist, Wolf Hoffman, I think is his name, like, has this whole shtick where he does metal arrangements of, like, Beethoven and stuff.
Right.
I honestly think it's horrible. But but it's evidence of the strong connection between classical music and heavy metal. And, like, the first academic book on heavy metal that Robert Walser wrote in the 80s, he's a musicologist. I think he taught at the University of Minnesota, actually. After talking about heavy metal's, what it owes to African American music as a form of rock and roll and that sort of thing, he talks about the practice of heavy metal musicians and how it overlaps with classical music. And so it's inextricable, really.
Yeah. Well, but before we get into your nonprofit, I had a question about your BMI affiliation. So for folks who don't know what that is as an organization, could you describe that first of all?
Yeah, so BMI is one of the two big performance royalty organizations that composers sign on to. And basically the idea is if you have pieces performed in venues that are licensed to BMI, you get a check for royalties.
And then with ASCAP being the other organization, I suppose,
Yes,
right?
ASCAP is the other big one. There's also one called CSAC, SESAC, which I think is bigger in Canada.
Yeah,
But
and
ASCAP and BMI are the biggest.
yeah, because in my undergraduate, I took one music business course, and the big point that the instructor was making was that we really need to fear these organizations because she described BMI specifically as having foot soldiers that just go into every corner of the world, every corner of the internet, looking for an opportunity to take something down because the rights aren't there. You know, there was a popular club along like the College Strip where I went down at the University of Memphis, and the whole and the whole business was shut down because a BMI person came in, heard some music, checked if they were registered or had paid their dues or whatever they hadn't, and sued them for so much that they had to get rid of the business. And and I'm just curious if that is the way you see the organization from the inside. These folks just working to dismantle media and content for the sake of money.
I don't, but I've had a pretty limited experience with them. I mean, I'll say that the reason I signed up with BMI is because they sent a representative to Michigan when I was a graduate student, and I was like, cool, I'll do that. And I've gotten some checks over the years, but I don't have a ton of performances every year, and many of them are not in licensed venues, so I wouldn't get royalties for them anyway. I think with popular music, they're much more active, and that's what you describe as really unfortunate sounding. Kind of sounds like Gilbert and Sullivan going around, sending henchmen around England to like make sure nobody was performing their music and like beating people up, and those stories of early copyright and enforcement. I mean, that sounds unfortunate, because I've always taken the approach that I want people to be able to hear my music, and if it's in a BMI venue, that's great. I'll get a little bit of money, but the most important thing is getting it out there. And I think there's so many other forces in the way people consume music, like Spotify and YouTube and Apple Music, that do such a bad job of getting creators compensation, that I think BMI does a better job. But the system for how we reward artistic creators in this country is so bad in so many complicated ways that I feel like it's a larger issue. BMI is probably contributing that in some ways, but there are a lot of other bad actors. And really, until we get to a point as a country where we want to recognize the public good that arts offer and contribute through public funding to the arts, I don't think we'll really have like a good system. So I'm not surprised that BMI isn't great. I mean, everyone complains. This is like composer shop talk is like, oh, I'm with ASCAP. They didn't give me money for this. This sucks. I'm with BMI. They didn't give me money for this. This sucks. Like, nobody's really happy about it. It's like health insurance or something, you know?
Yeah, and hopefully they won't be after us now, Scott. Now that I've said something, but and Scott, you deal with gathering the rights and all that stuff for
Right.
what we. I mean, do you have any reaction to what you're hearing Garrett say?
There's just even more hoops now than there ever has been,
Wow.
especially when you add the video component to it, because
Mm,
there's a different set of rights when the music is synced to video, and they call that sync rights. So you have to make sure that that
Hmm.
is taken care of.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so there's just a now, like you said, I'm all for artists getting paid for their
of
work and
course.
their performances. I do think that the process could be a little easier,
Yeah,
you
and it
know?
seems like a really a nuanced conversation to have because the conversation of compensating artists, but also the idea of getting the music out there. Because you can't pay
Right.
your rent with exposure, as we say all the time. But
Yeah.
there is something to unearthing the art of individuals and Garrett, as I was preparing for this interview, just looking at the website for ＡPEX Contemporary Concert, there were composers there that I hadn't heard of. So just the balance between honoring artists, but also just honoring their art and making sure that it's spread and that people know about it.
Yeah.
I think maybe BMI is representative of some of the more pernicious like cultural elements in music, which comes down to like I need to get as much as I can for myself, and there's not as much. This is not related to BMI, but just in general, not as much interest in let's build things for others. Let's create an infrastructure that is sustainable instead of, I got to make sure I get mine. And that's something with composers I know and stuff, there's a lot of inequality. There are composers who can make a living through commissions and that sort of things, but many of us don't. I won't probably ever pay my mortgage with performance royalties, maybe 1 month of my mortgage with performance royalties that I get. But if we had a more, I don't know, self-sustaining or cooperative collectivist attitude, we could probably build a structure where people are getting their music out there and also getting compensated in a better way.
Well, and it seems that, in your own way, you've done just that with ＡPEX Contemporary Concert. How did you come up with that name? Does ＡPEX have a specific meaning or purpose to it?
So my partner in ＡPEX Contemporary Performance, Kevin Fitzgerald, our music director, he had the name when he approached me with the idea. And sort of the reason for the name was he had the logo idea, so we wanted that ligature A.
Mm-hmm.
And then also we wanted to have high standards for the repertoire that we program and the quality of the concerts that we produce. And so the idea of Apex being symbolic is just about we're trying to do our best with everything that we do.
Yeah. Yeah, and a conversation that Scott and I have all the time is knowing an individual understanding and knowing their role and their purpose within a space, and how that can kind of be shaken up in its own way. I'm just going to be frank with this organization. It's headed by two white men, and then I get on
Mm-hmm.
the website and I see nothing but people of color. Does that reflect the work, or is this just putting on a good face for people who happen to come across the website and learn about your organization?
Well, first of all, I think that's a very fair criticism. It's reflective of stuff we're doing this year, specifically. And so we have, since our first concert, we've had a lot of programming focusing on composers of African descent because it's related to this research project that we're doing as well. We just had a board meeting a couple of days ago where we were talking about the need to have different leadership and finding people with different identities. Fortunately, with the research project that we're doing, the ÄPEX anthology, we have an advisory board that is all people of color, because with that particular project, we know that we need to include other voices. But Yeah, I mean, it's something that I can't really, I'm not going to make an excuse for. We just need to do better with that. I mean, it's very localized to this year in terms of the programming that we're doing, although we've always tried to program with an eye to rarely performed and underrepresented composers with respect to our state, Michigan, where we do all of our performances. And it's a really fair observation and something that is a big concern for us.
Well, I mean, and the fact that you're having that conversation and just acknowledging that truth, I think, is so much more and so much better than a lot of the organizations are doing. To be quite frank, does the organization have a grounding philosophy or set of values? What is this nonprofit in a sentence or in a word?
So our mission is to share the music of rarely performed and underrepresented 20th and 21st century composers from around the world with audiences across Michigan.
And how do
So
you?
it's really about
Oh, go
whose
ahead.
music is not happening in Michigan and how can we make it happen.
Yeah, yeah, that Michigan aspect seems to be a very important part of it. So, are you finding that there are artists and composers that are underrepresented in Michigan specifically, or how does the Michiganness of Apex tie into it?
Well, from a contemporary music standpoint, the other presenters who do contemporary music are pretty aesthetically focused on minimalism and post-minimalism.
Mm.
So like a rarely performed composer in Michigan would be like a modernist or something like that. But then also we have the traditional issues of exclusion, like programming being biased towards white men, and so if we do programs with women composers or composers of color, regardless of style, that's also bringing in voices that aren't being heard. And then there's also a geographical concentration of where contemporary music is happening in Michigan, focused in Southeast Michigan. So we're based in Southeast Michigan, but we've performed in other places as well. We sort of have a master plan of building a statewide infrastructure for contemporary music that represents everyone in the state who's creating it and also who's not being performed in the state from elsewhere.
Yeah, what's your process of locating some of these underrepresented artists? Because again, as I mentioned, I learned about two composers just visiting your website. What's the process of unearthing some of these more obscure names?
Some of it comes from the performers that we work with. So we're not an ensemble. We will hire people locally to perform programming that we come up with, or we will present people from our area or from other places who have a program that they've already come up with. And so sometimes we just go on YouTube or Twitter and look for composers, or we think about composers we know. If we're looking for a specific instrumentation or length of a piece, or maybe we have something more thematic in mind. Or also people will come to us and be like, we have this program, it's all art songs by women composers. We don't know any of the composers, but it works with what we're doing. And so we learn as much from the people we work with as I guess we teach people by looking up composers.
That's interesting. And you're using that word composer. I sit on the board of the American Composers Forum, and something that we've been talking about is, obviously, how we are beginning to redefine the phrase classical music, but also the word composer and what is a composer. Is that a word that you use purposefully, or is it do you deal with artists who don't necessarily follow the classical track? What is that conversation like within Apex?
We've definitely presented a range of artistic voices, and I mean I use the term composer because being a composer is just what comes to mind
Hmm.
first. But we've worked with people who would define that in a lot of different ways. Like we're having the composer and toy pianist, electronic musician Elizabeth A. Baker come in March, and she has a very different approach to her creative identity than anyone else that we worked with, and we're interested in her music because it's very different from some of this from what we've done before. So we're open to people who have a lot of different approaches and would probably define that word in different ways.
So, I've been thinking about how I want to ask this question. You know, when going back to the Michigan centric nature of Apex and how geography plays into these conversations. You know, Michigan is home to one of the most famous orchestras in the country, if not the world. I've played with them. And one of the frustrations that I've seen with a lot of with folks who do work like yours as it relates to the big orchestras and the big classical music organizations is that they just don't want to push or pull or change what they're doing. Have you managed to have collaborations with the Detroit Symphony Orchestra or other really big organizations around the country?
Only tangentially. So the DSO hosts this annual contemporary music marathon concert every September that's run by a different organization in Detroit called New Music Detroit. And it happens at the Maxim Fisher Music Center. So we performed at that a couple times. And so because of that, have overlapped with DSO administrators and that sort of thing. But no, we haven't. I mean, we're a very small organization. We're in the middle of our 5th season. We've done a lot of events. We've done 25 events, which is way too many, but we just kind of do what we are able to do, even if it's maybe more than we should. The kinds of partnerships along those lines that we have mostly been with universities across the state. So like last year, we did a big residency at Central Michigan University in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, which was great because there's really no other reason that we would have ever performed there. And if we go back, it'll probably be under similar circumstances. And so it was wonderful to have the chance to bring programming that wouldn't necessarily happen in Mount Pleasant, Michigan to Mount Pleasant, Michigan, which is much closer to what we're trying to do with the organization than become like an annex of the DSO. Because they do a ton of their own programming and they don't, even though for one of the major orchestras in the States, they have interesting programming that's relatively diverse, which doesn't say very much in reality. But we don't consider ourselves in competition with them. We admire what they do, but we consider it pretty different from what we do.
But I'm curious about your personal feelings as far as pushing forward these underrepresented and relatively obscure composers and artists. Do large organizations, in your personal opinion, not have a role in that work? It seems like all of that work can't be done by just the small organizations like yours.
Oh, of course they do. But I think that there is a disconnect with organizations that focus on traditional classical music. So I'm talking common practice period, the big names, 1600s to early 1900s. I think they have a disconnect. This is just speculative.
Of course,
but
yeah.
There's a disconnect in like what they feel like their responsibilities are in terms of representing composers with different identities relative to contemporary music, because there's kind of this myth that, yes, with living composers or composers who are active in the 20th century, we can't deny that there were a lot of women, we can't deny that there were people of color, but that's not the responsibility of organizations that focus on the 19th century or the 18th century, which is a myth because the 18th and 19th century also had a lot of women, also had a lot of people of color who were writing music that is stylistically similar to what like an orchestra or opera company would do, even longer before the 18th century. I'm just oversimplifying.
Sure, yeah.
And so I think that I think like a lot of orchestras that I have seen, they're like, oh, we'll do a piece by a woman composer, but it's a living woman composer. Or we'll do, like the Met is doing the Terence Blanchard opera, the first opera by an African-American composer that they've done. Well, he's
Right.
alive, but, Harry Lawrence Freeman was writing operas in the 1890s, and who's African-American. So there's sort of this misunderstanding, and I think traditionally focused classical music institutions, which would be not just orchestras and opera companies, but music departments at colleges too, that like classical music with a capital C, that history, we understand it, it was all white men. Well, that's not actually true. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect where diverse programming has become the responsibility for contemporary focused organizations and not the responsibility of traditionally focused organizations.
Yeah, that is
And
that's a very interesting point and a very important point, that it's not just about, again, the new music, but the traditional canon itself is very diverse, but it hasn't been tapped and explored.
yeah, and if you look at the history, there have like the first woman to publish classical music, Maddalena Casulana, she was Italian, 16th century. She publishes a book of madrigals, and in the front matter talks about I am publishing this music because there are too many men who think women can't write music. And then 300 years later, Hans von Bülow is quoted saying that there will never be a woman composer. And that's like
Mhm.
obviously wrong. But you can see it's cyclical and recursive, this idea that at a time, the group of people who are practicing what we generally label classical music is very pluralistic, just like now. But then that diversity gets erased. And then there's another generation that's much more pluralistic than what we think, but then that gets erased over and over and over again. So we're at this point where we can't deny that in the present there are people with a lot of identities doing composed music, concert music, art music, whatever you're doing. But because we've adopted a mythological understanding of the history, it's like, well, in the 19th century, it was only men, and that's just not true.
I'm wondering if what sort of things you're hearing anecdotally after your concerts. Is there a thirst for these unknown compositions? What are you experiencing after the fact?
Well, I think what's been helpful to us is that stylistically, the music that we program is generally really foreign because it's contemporary music. It's not traditional sounding, even though there are living composers who write in a sort of neo-romantic way. We tend not to program that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
And so because of the foreignness of the aesthetic, if it's a composer that these people have, the audience members haven't heard, that's not as important. It's more like, oh, that piece was so different, or I'd never heard anything like that before in terms of the sounds that were coming out of the instruments or electronics or voices on stage. And so that it was a prepared solo violin piece by Anahita Abbasi, who's an Iranian American composer. Like the fact that she's a woman of color is not as big a talking point as like that piece was really different sounding.
Do you think it should be a big talking point, the identity behind the music?
I think it's important insofar as there should be equitable opportunities for people, regardless of their background, to be able to create and have what they create be performed and heard by people. But I don't really know if it matters in terms of the like audience's experience with the music, because the piece is going to connect with them or it's not going to connect with them, and that has to do with the performance, that has to do with the sounds, that doesn't have, I mean, it has something to do with the person behind the piece, but I don't know, I'm not as concerned about like people reading into, like with Anahita Abbasi's piece, I haven't talked to her about that piece. I don't know if there's something about her experience as an Iranian American woman that went into that piece. So I wouldn't be comfortable speculating. And the audience is happy to go on a journey imagining what that could be, but it's more important of like how it sounds in the room during the concert. And then as long as people have the opportunity to create what they want to create and get it heard, regardless of their identity, that's as much as it matters to me.
Yeah, because Scott, we have this conversation a lot. Do we need to say that music by an Afro-American composer or a
Mm-hmm.
woman composer? And I don't know, from my perspective, the idea of non-dead white men who wrote classical music, I think that is still not common knowledge that as Garrett has talked about here, it's not common knowledge that the canon is indeed very diverse, but we just haven't always explored a lot of it. That's why I always bring identity into it. I mean, what are your thoughts on it after hearing what Garrett had to say?
Well, it's evolving, I think. Obviously, whenever I've had a person of color, a composer of color, I mention that. But I feel like as soon as I say a woman composer's name, you're going to know it's a woman.
Sure, sure,
So I
sure.
don't know if we necessarily need that identifier. But if they identify differently, if they use a they them pronoun or
Sure.
something, then you go that direction.
Right, if I say the name Germaine Taillefer, somebody might not necessarily know that that is a woman composer from
Cécile
France.
Chaminade. Yeah.
The same thing.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
there's a French 18th century composer, Hyacinthe Jadin, who's a man, but has a name that would make you think that maybe he's not a man, or didn't identify as male.
Yeah.
So it can be complicated, like in the context of a radio show or something, like it's hard to know how to present that and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Who have you found that you're really excited about? What music really surprised you?
Oh, that's such a big question. I'll say that, so in the last year, I've been really focusing on this research project, which is, I'm in New York City right now, actually working with the manuscripts of Harry Lawrence Freeman, so they can be used for future instructional materials and that sort of thing. And I didn't learn anything about the history of African American composers, at all, when I was in music school.
And
I've
you
been
have a
very
doctorate.
fortunate. Yeah, I mean, it's a doctorate in composition. Some people might
still,
think that that's not as serious, but
Oh, it is.
no, it's enormously troubling, and I listening back to some episodes of your show, like when Melanie Dodson was on here, and she went to Appalachian State.
She
where I
did,
taught,
yeah.
and she was like, I wanted to program women composers, but I didn't know who any of them were. And so similar to her, I was not really taught about that. And so it's been a big focal point for me in the last 12 months is learning more about that. And I fortunately, because of relationships I have with amazing scholars and artists like Naomi Andre, the musicologist at the University of Michigan, who's been really influential in the research we're doing with ＡPEX, and Anthony R. Green, the composer-pianist who also helps lead Castle of Our Skins, the amazing concert presenter in Boston. They've given me a lot of guidance and resources, and I've been able to go to places like Columbia University to work with Harry Lawrence Freeman's manuscripts, and then also the Library of Congress to look at music by these free Black composers who were active before the Civil War. That's not something I ever knew about.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that has always challenged me as a composer in America is what is American classical music? Because it's something that's kind of, classical music is something we sort of imported from Europe in a lot of ways. And even a major orchestra like the DSO, it's almost like European aristocratic cosplay in a way.
Yeah.
And so if I'm trying to create as an American composer, what is the tradition that I can sort of look at or be inspired by? And it just it's so exciting to like look at this piece by Francis Johnson from 1820, and it's like to imagine what he went through as a free black man in Philadelphia who had a huge musical career that I knew nothing about. And so it's those moments, particularly in the last year, that it's not contemporary music at all, but it's very new to me, and has totally changed the way I think about the history of classical music, and just as like my identity as an American composer, but also like when I teach and stuff, it's like we never talk about American music until the 20th century. Like, why do we do that?
Hmm.
There's a lot of it before, and it's different than what's happening in Europe, although a lot of it was not that different. And so that journey has been the most exciting thing for me of late.
Tides are changing, and when you talk about all of the things that you didn't learn in music school, when I acknowledge the things that I did not learn, you are in one of those positions to teach, the next generation about all of this forgotten and overlooked history. I'll use the word excuse. The excuse that I feel a lot of organizations make, whether it's orchestras, organizations like ours even, is that we just don't know. We don't know where to find all of this information and all of these names. Is the Apex anthology and the other research you're doing, is this something that's available to the general public?
It will be. Not yet, because we're still like very much in the early stages of putting it together. But the idea is that it will be a free online resource really targeted at people in teaching positions like mine who are well-meaning but are overworked and don't have time to do the research that I'm doing and our organization is doing, and like Anthony R. Green, for example, has helped enormously with scores that he's accessed and stuff. And we are focusing intentionally on pieces that don't have modern editions and have not been recorded commercially, as an idea of just opening up the world of musical examples that will be accessible to instructors. Because there are other efforts kind of along these lines. A lot of people are thinking about this now, like, why are music theory curricula so focused on the music of a limited number of white, male, mostly German composers? There were recent presentations at the Society of Music Theory conference about this. There's a really recent New Music Box article about all of this. And we don't want to compete with any of these other initiatives or anything like that. We just want to help make it easier for instructors to have a more representative curriculum, at least within like what that curriculum is defined now. I think a fair critique of the anthology is like not trying to be transformative. It's just trying to take the structure of the traditional music theory curriculum and make it possible to teach that with more representative examples. And there are a lot of reasons for that, not the least of which is having a focus makes the project easier to do. But because of the identity of our organization's leadership, my identity, it's not really we don't feel like it's our job to define like what a Black music theory curriculum would be. That's not my thing to decide. But what I can do is be like, you can teach this curriculum with a much more representative repertoire. And then that challenges, why was this repertoire not included in the first place? And when you start to follow that, then you realize that there's a broader structure, hierarchies of power and inequality that shaped this, that are actually super dark. And it sort of leads people to want to redesign it.
Yeah.
That's what we're hoping.
Just really acknowledging that the present is on purpose. It wasn't just by
Yes.
happenstance. Well, if people want to keep up with this work or have access to this anthology when it's all done, how can they do that?
So we have an email address. anthology.aepexcp@gmail.org. And if you go on our website, there's a bunch of information about the anthology and then also that email address. And we have some materials that are like in the pilot stage that we've sent to people at a few different schools across the country. And so if you want to be involved with that, just email that address, or you can find me on Twitter at GARRT, and I'll help guide you there. We're sort of at the point where we're collecting a lot of materials and then shaping it into what we'll be doing for a while, shaping it into like clips of scores, audio recordings, things that like an instructor could easily put into the PowerPoints that they already have or whatever resources they already have. Because a big untold part of this, although we sort of touched on it before, is with the labor situation facing music school faculty, when you don't have job security, when you're getting paid really poorly, when you have to teach a ton of classes, like more than one person's normal workload, of course you don't have time to track down a piece by Vicente Lusitano, who's the first composer of African descent that we know ever published music. Like, it's hard to like grade and lesson plan and all of that. And so the hope with this is that it will make it easier for instructors to cross those barriers. And then their students will benefit because they'll be exposed to a more pluralistic traditional history of classical music.
Wow, wow. As I said, you're doing the good work.
Mhm.
And so, and for folks in Michigan who want to catch some of the Apex Contemporary Performance concerts, how can they learn more about that?
So our website, aepexcontemporary.org, has all of that. We have a Twitter account at AEPEXCP and also a Facebook page. And we have a mailing list that you can sign up for on our website to keep abreast of everything we're doing. And we have 3 programs coming up for the rest of the year with guest artists who are all African American, amazing musicians. The composer pianist Anthony R. Green, Elizabeth A. Baker, who I mentioned before, and then a fabulous pianist, Leah Claiborne, who was actually in my remedial aural skills class when I was teaching at Michigan. And she has done fascinating research on similar topics related to pedagogical piano music and the inclusion of music by African American composers into that. But she's also an amazing pianist too. So that's sort of the rest of our season, and people are always welcome to travel out to Michigan to hear what we're doing.
Of course. Well, Garrett Schumann, Dr. Garrett Schumann, thanks so much for taking the time by speaking with us and telling us more about your projects.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me, and I'm a huge fan of this show, so it's really an honor to be part of it, and keep up the good work.
Oh, thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Garrett. So what did you take away from the conversation with Garrett Schumann? What did you personally bring out of it? Because I noticed you sitting up and taking notice a couple times.
I mean, there were so many different parts of the conversation that that perked my attention. The first, we dropped into the conversation of BMI a little bit and rights and all that sort of thing. And he has, I don't know, it's difficult for me to accept the idea of paying an artist in exposure. It's so important to validate what they're doing in the correct way. But his feelings about it being important for the music and just the acknowledgement and the awareness of the art to be out there was really important to me. And again, when I go to the website, apexcontemporary.org, and see some of the performances that are coming up by these composers that I hadn't heard of, that's huge to me. And that's something I'm going to think a little bit more about. Maybe something that we should be thinking about as we start to put together this triloquy series here in
Right.
the
And
Twin Cities.
one of the things that I was started to think about as Garrett was talking was something that I've talked about on the air before. We hear Beethoven, Mozart, Haydn, all these sorts of things. But, just like today, you have very talented musicians who might be in a neighborhood band,
Mm-hmm.
or they might play solo every once in a while when they want to, and maybe they jotted down something here and there. I wonder who the next name is, who in 100 years we're going to say, this was discovered in 2019, in a stack
Yeah.
of whatever papers or whatever. I wonder what that's going to be. What that,
Probably maybe something that is very common to us,
mm,
because and not to get too deep into the music history conversation, but folks weren't really listening much to Bach until Felix Mendelssohn came along, and
exactly.
or like the Beethoven violin concerto that all the violinists learned. Mendelssohn revived that piece of music. So I guess you never know.
Fritz Kreisler brought back Vivaldi.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Oh, and well, good for you,
and,
Fritz
and
Chrysler.
here we are.
So a name that I hadn't always known that I know now is Celso Machado, and you
Mm,
know that name now as well, right?
right.
An Afro-Brazilian composer who you've been in touch with concerning
I
rights and
have
all
to
that
call
sort of
him
thing.
back today.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
Well, his music is actually going to be featured on the next opus of Triloquy. So the newest addition to the C24 team, Melissa Dundas, joins Scott and myself in Studio B.
yeah.
And we just kind of sit around and have a conversation about being a classical radio host, her journey here. I think it's really laid back, really fun. I'm wishing I had one of those cupcakes right now.
And if you want to hear Garrett call us pedantic,
Oh,
just
what?
tune in. I just remember you went, "This is so pedantic" at one point. That was great.
Okay, well then I'll be tuned in as well. Send all of your feedback to Triloquy at AmericanPublicMedia.org.
Subscribe and rate us while you're at it. It helps.
And you want to go ahead and shout out I don't know if we've ever shouted out the social medias. Should we do that?
Yours or ours? I mean, the Triloquy one or our personal ones?
If you want to find us on social media, Twitter, Instagram, look us
Okay.
up.
Yeah. On Instagram, I'm L Scott Blankenship, and on the Twitters, it's S_B_Triloquy.
On all social media platforms, I'm me. There's only one Garrett McQueen, two R's, two T's, as Garrett Schumann spells his name correctly. We talked about that a little bit.
Yep.
Handle McQueen of the night. Anyway, Happy New Year again. We're still in early January, so
Yep.
so yeah, feeling good for 2020, and always glad to have you here listening to Triloquy. We'll see you next time.